I'm Volker Nocke, and it's a pleasure to chair this session. And our keynote speaker is Michael Whinston. Doesn't really need an introduction. As you know, he's a professor of economics at MIT, and also the Sloan Fellows of Professor of Management at the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And I guess for me, at least, maybe I'm biased, but I find it hard to think of anyone who has made more important contributions to antitrust economics. But let me just remind the audience that Mike not only has made important contributions to antitrust, but has also made important contributions to microeconomic theory, even to game theory through collision-proof Nash equilibria or menu auctions, but also in recent years he has made important contributions to empirical I/O and the I/O of the health sector, and in fact has also won for one of the empirical papers the Frisch Medal of the Econometric Society. So today Mike is going to talk about a topic that has been working on for some time, namely horizontal merger policy. And somewhat embarrassed what he's presenting is joint work with me. And anyway, but all the glory, of course, goes to Mike. So Mike, the floor is yours. You have an hour.
Okay, thanks, Volker. Thanks first to the organizers for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here talking to you. It was a little awkward for Volker. I know he had to constrain himself to not talk about what a great talk it was going to be. But he managed. So, okay. So the topic today I'm going to talk about is concentration screens for horizontal mergers. So just by way of background, I'm sure for this audience, most or all of you are familiar with this, but concentration screens play a very central role in merger analysis, particularly horizontal merger analysis. So in the US, for example, the horizontal merger guidelines, adopt, both safe harbors and anti-competitive presumptions based on both the post-merger level of the Herfindahl index and also the change in that index, where the change is naively computed. Take the current market shares of the firms, the merging firms, add them up, put that in squared back into your Herfindahl index, and that gives you the post-merger level and, of course, the change. The EU and the UK and other countries all, I won't be speaking about them specifically today, but they all also have, use these same kind of concentration thresholds. So these presumptions, play an important role. In the US, both in the agency's merger investigations, so in, early on, some rough sense of, well, what might turn out to be a reasonable market definition. What do shares look like in that? In some rough sense, sometimes share numbers aren't even available, but there's some sense of that. To decide whether to investigate proposed merger further, issue a second request, that concentration levels will matter for that. And then especially also in court proceedings and in the decision whether to go to court. So in the US, there's something that gets referred to as the structural presumption, which is based on these kinds of concentration numbers. And often the courts will cite the horizontal merger guidelines for those structural presumptions. Now, I should say in the title, when we refer to, quote, concentration screens, we're really thinking of both of these roles that they play, both early on and then later in litigation, or in, potential litigation that might be in the background as agencies and the parties negotiate over a settlement. Okay, so, with that as background, though, it's somewhat awkward to say that, the basis for these presumptions, both in form and in their form and in their level, remains rather unclear. So, I've been, teaching IO to grad students for, more years than I care to count. And it, you know, I have to admit, it's just at some level to some discomfort every time I came to this lecture where I would be talking, you know, this point in the lecture where I'd be talking about these concentration screens, because in you know, invariably, or, you know, maybe not quite invariably, but, you know, often, you know, lucky occasions, nobody would ask, but often they would, about, you know, where these things come from, and, you know, why they are what they are. And, you know, I didn't really have a great answer for that. And so at some level, this project, you know, helped me understand that a little bit better. Okay. So what are we going to do? You know, what do we do in this paper? Well, you know, basically we examine these presumptions, and we do so focusing on mergers' unilateral effects. I should say more accurately, unilateral price effects. And in doing so, we make two basic points. You know, the first is that there's both a theoretical and empirical basis for focusing really only on the change in the Herfindahl index and not on its level. Or more generally, I should, you know, focusing on the merging firm shares when screening mergers for whether they're going to harm consumers because of unilateral effects. And I should say this is not a point that's totally new to us. You know, it's a point that's been noted theoretically, you know, before, say, in the, you know, including, for example, in the 2006 horizontal merger guidelines commentary in the U.S. But, you know, it seems to not have been widely appreciated, nor really incorporated widely, I think, into practice. You know, certainly, you know, I can admit, you know, myself to not really fully appreciating this point before we worked on this paper. And so here, what we're going to do, you know, having said that it's been noted before, here what we're going to do is offer really two things. One is some new theoretical results, and then second, an empirical examination to look at to what extent this seems to be correct, or, you know, what. Okay, so second, the levels, the second point we're going to make is that the levels at which the current presumptions are set may well be too lax. You know, there's a lot of attention to this question in the US and you know, I think elsewhere. So we're going to argue that it may well be too lax, at least unless one's crediting large efficiency gains. And by that, we mean like 5% or larger to the typical merger, or a significant presumption that entry, repositioning, or other factors are going to greatly limit the anti-competitive effects of a typical merger. So, you know, when I say this, you know, I think the basic view that, you know, to think about when you're thinking about these kind of presumptions is, you know, what does a typical merger, you know, how should we think about a typical merger? You know, what kind of, you know, without delving into looking at efficiency gains, what should we kind of give as a credit at some level to the typical merger in terms of its likely efficiency gains when we're thinking about what these presumptions should be. Okay, so how are we going to do, you know, these are the 2 points we're going to make. How are we going to do this? So, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to focus, you know, as what I just said a moment ago suggests, you know, mergers, and we all know mergers, you know, absent any efficiencies are typically going to harm consumers. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus throughout on what synergy level or what efficiency gain is required to prevent consumer harm, and how it's related to measures of concentration. So in that sense, it's, you know, the basic idea is similar to UPP. You know, how much efficiency gain do we need? How much does marginal cost have to go down in order to prevent consumer harm? But the particular focus is going to be its relation to these measures of concentration. And we're going to do this in 2 parts. The first part of the talk is I'm going to look at theoretically the determinants of required synergies in, actually here it says 2 models, but actually 3 models in which one might hope to have some kind of clear relationship between this kind of the required synergy and market shares and concentration. One is the Cornea Model, of course, and the other are CES and Logit models of differentiated goods price competition. So, you know, certainly in many settings, it's not going to be the case that, you know, just shares and concentration or that and some kind of elasticity measure are going to be enough. simple elasticity measure, but in these models, we're going to show you that it is, and then look at specifically in what way. The second thing we're going to do, following on that, and having just said that, well, in many, in those special models, we will have shown that it's true, that you really want to focus on the shares of the merging firms, and to look at this. And as when you do, we'll be pointing at what kind of levels of change in concentration or levels of those shares matter, relate to different levels of efficiencies, but they're very special models. And so what we're going to do in the second part of the paper is something that's more empirically oriented. So we're going to look at the US beer industry, and we're going to use demand and marginal costs that have been estimated by Miller and Weinberg's in their econometrica paper, recent econometrica paper. And we're going to look for various hypothetical mergers, given those actual demand and marginal costs, or estimated ones, I should say, what the relationship is between concentration measures and required synergies. And the thing about doing that is, their model, it's a model of differentiated price competition, but their demand does not fit into the CES or Logent models. It's a random coefficient nested Logent model. And so it's a definitely, richer structure than just the ones we look at in the theoretical section. And so we're going to look to that to see whether, as you move beyond those models, the same kind of points emerge. Okay. Actually, Volker, how do you want to do questions? Should I pause at points, or do you want to go straight through and then have discussion after? Don't hear you. You're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, you could pause and we can see whether any questions. Otherwise, you just go on. Yeah. So if,
okay. All right.
Or perhaps people who would like to ask, maybe they could just put it in the chat, and then I can see whether there's anything. And
okay. All right. Why don't you moderate it, because it's hard for me to monitor
chat. And
so just chime in if there's something that you'd like me to pause and, have someone ask a question. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is talk about at least the US horizontal merger guidelines and their history, by way of setting the stage. So in the US, the merger guidelines were first introduced by the Department of Justice in 1968. It was a time of great hostility towards mergers. The key thing that they focused on was preventing concentrated industries. And they had, by today's standards, what appear to be quite stringent presumptions of anti-competitive harm. Interestingly, those presumptions were based largely on merging firm shares. So here I'm showing what those presumptions were. On the left are the anti-competitive presumptions in markets with four-firm concentration ratio above 75%. So, if you had two firms that, an acquiring firm that had a 4% share and was acquiring a firm that had 4% or more, that merger was presumed to be anti-competitive or was likely to be challenged. And you can see, a 10% acquiring firm with a 2% acquired firm would also trigger that presumption, et cetera. So, quite stringent. 2-4% firms are going to be challenged in a highly concentrated market. B, if you look to the right, you see what the standards are in less concentrated markets, by which I mean markets with four-firm concentration ratios below 75%. And a kind of key thing to note here is there's almost no difference. So, okay, in a less concentrated market, the thresholds are higher, but barely higher. So two firms with 5% share are going to be acquired. The last thing I would just point out about this is, relative to, the way we typically think about these things, it's kind of notable that it mattered who was acquiring and who was acquired. We don't, typically consider those kind of things today, although, I think it's not to say that it might not matter. So for example, which firm is acquiring, you might think could affect, how effectively efficiencies would be achieved in the organization, perhaps. But in any case, we won't focus on that going forward today. Okay, so that was the story, 1968. We flash forward to 1982, and the DOJ guidelines were revised in very substantial ways. First, the 4-firm concentration ratio was replaced with the Herfindahl index. By some kind of oral history. That was partly because the Assistant Attorney General Bill Baxter at the time really liked George Stigler's theory of oligopoly paper, in which the likelihood of collusion was related to levels of the Herfindahl index in an admittedly special model, but that seemingly it was partly responsible for the change to the Herfindahl index. It also focused much more than before on the level of concentration. So what I'm showing here in a graph is what the presumptions were in the 1982 guidelines. So green, so on the horizontal axis is the level of the HHI over here, and on the vertical axis is the change in the HHI. And green are mergers that would be presumed to be not raise concerns. So you might consider it a safe harbor. At the other extreme, the red area is the anti-competitive presumption. So those mergers were highly likely to be challenged. And the yellow area were mergers that were considered to be in between. So, raise potential competitive concerns subject to other sorts of evidence. Now, compared to the previous guidelines, the 5% mergers that merger between 5% firms, which before would have been considered, triggered the anti-competitive presumption, that's a merger that has delta HHI equal to 50. And so, that's something that would have been, suddenly actually fallen into the green safe harbor typically. So, the presumptions were much more lenient. It may have been countered somewhat by the introduction of the hypothetical monopolist test, which, can lead to narrower market definitions. But I think by any standards, things became more lenient with this change. As I, just noted, the 82 guidelines touched on, as I just touched on, the 82 guidelines introduced many other changes in innovation, the hypothetical monopolist test being one example. Another point about them is there was a very heavy focus on coordinated effects, rather than unilateral effects, that is, effects coming from collusion. And, it's, perhaps also related to, Stigler's article, but during this time period, much of the focus of antitrust enforcement was concerns about collusion. That's very different than today, when almost all merger challenges are focusing on unilateral effects. These guidelines were revised in 1992 when they became actually jointly issued by both the DOJ and the FTC. And, at that time, basically, with small changes, these thresholds really did not change. Sorry, I should have said these thresholds didn't change. There were some small other changes in terms of the guidelines. Finally, moving to the latest revision in 2010, the DOJ FTC guidelines that were issued then, I've now, here I'm showing the change in those, in the thresholds. And what you can see is basically they've become even more lenient. So the green area now, both the delta HHI thresholds, those have been bumped up from 50 and 100 to 100 and 200. The HHI levels have been bumped up to 1,500 and 2,500. Things are becoming more lenient. I think the second thing to note, which is quite striking, is this was actually the first time, to my knowledge, that the motivation behind the thresholds was explicitly stated. And what was explicitly stated is it was an attempt, the guidelines were changed, the thresholds were changed in this way in order to achieve greater transparency. That is, in order to match better what the DOJ and FTC were actually doing. So, once again, in that sense, the actual, economic motivation for the levels of these thresholds or the way they're constructed, the presumptions are constructed, and the form of them was not stated. Okay, so this is just a table from the FTC on second requests from 1996 to 2011 on second. So, the FTC and DOJ, if they screen mergers, decide to investigate them further, they issue a second request. This is showing you the percent of those second requests that saw enforcement actions of some kind, and whether it's a settlement or actually going to court. The main point to take from this is the level of concentration here does really matter. Another thing which you can't take from this is that very few, if you look at the number of second requests, there are very few second requests at low levels of concentration. We give the numbers in the paper, but it's very clear that not only do the guidelines say that they're looking at concentration levels, they actually are. Those concentration levels are in fact mattering. Okay, one last comment, which is about concentration and market definition. So, starting, as I said, in the 1982 guidelines, the guidelines describe this hypothetical monopolist test in defining relevant antitrust markets. And of course, if we're talking about concentration screens, you can't measure concentration until you define a market. Now, that hypothetical monopolist test, also, as I mentioned, it can lead to narrow markets. In fact, often very narrow markets. And so, for example, in the beer market that we are going to talk about later, if you look at the estimated demand system, frequently just, if you went to the narrowest market that the hypothetical monopolist test would allow, with some frequency, it would turn out to be just the two merging firms. Now, the thing is, in reality, when the agencies go to court, they don't typically allege the narrowest market that the hypothetical monopolist test would seemingly allow them to do. That is, rather they, will allege more natural markets. They'll say they're applying the hypothetical monopolist test to show that those those broader markets are, satisfy the test, but they're not defining the narrowest markets that they could. And, I think, the clear reason is that judges, I think, would be very skeptical of some of the markets that emerge from the hypothetical monopolist test. And, would start, being concerned that the DOJ is just, coming up with some gerrymandered definition in order to drive up concentration numbers. So just as an example, in recent beer mergers, and there have been a number of them, what the DOJ has alleged are not, the two merging firms, but rather local beer markets, where they, it's city-based markets for beer, and which are exactly what we're going to look at later when we look at we do our analysis for the beer industry. So, if that's the case, it's really concentration levels in these more natural markets that's what's relevant for assessing whether the current concentration thresholds are too lax. And so when we later talk about elasticities in the theory section, or we define markets, in the beer analysis that we're going to do later, we're going to focus on these kind of broader markets. The elasticities are going to be the kind of elasticities that you might expect in those broader markets. And when we do the beer analysis, we'll be looking at local markets for beer. Okay. So that's everything by way of background. Shall I continue, Volker?
Oh, yeah. So I don't see any questions,
Okay.
so just continue.
Okay, so what I'm going to do first is, as I said earlier, is talk about a bit about our theoretical analysis. So we first look at the Cornea model. It's the most obvious model to look at for when you might have concentration levels being a central thing in predicting the effects of a merger. So what I want to do is imagine a two-firm merger, say between firms M and N. Okay, and each firm F has a pre-merger marginal cost of CF and a pre-merger market share of SF. And so equation star just below is the first order condition before the merger for the firms. I'll also define the post-merger share naively computed for the two firms as S capital M, which is just the sum of the two firms' pre-merger shares. And as well, the pre-merger marginal cost, average marginal cost for the merger partners is just the share-weighted marginal costs. And then finally, the post-merger marginal cost for the merging firms, I'll denote by C bar M. Okay, so a standard condition for when a merger is going to be what we call, Volker and I have called consumer surplus neutral, that is leaving the price in the market unchanged, is that the post-merger margin for the merged firm, evaluated, of course, using its post-merger marginal cost, is just equal to the sum of the pre-merger margins. And basically what this is saying is that the margin has to increase enough to exactly offset the fact that the market power term, the P prime times market share term is getting bigger because the market share is increasing. So, this basically is a condition that tells you what is the post-merger efficiency level have to be, or marginal cost have to be for the merger to not harm consumers. Any greater level of marginal cost than this, i.e. any lower level of synergy, and consumers will be harmed. Okay, so let's just first consider a merger between, to consider an easy case between symmetric firms. So the two merging firms each initially have the same marginal cost that I'll denote by CM, and they each have the same market share. And so, i.e. that's going to be equal to the sum of their market shares, SM, divided by 2. So rewriting that expression for consumer surplus neutrality, you can rewrite this as an expression in terms of the percentage gain, efficiency gain. That is, how much lower is marginal cost as a fraction of the pre-merger marginal cost. And what it's equal to is just the absolute gross margin, P minus CM, before the merger. Before the, measured in terms of the average marginal cost of the two firms divided by that average marginal cost. Now, the pre-merger first order condition gives you an expression for that pre-merger average marginal cost. And then we just substitute it in and we get an expression for this required efficiency gain. And that required efficiency gain, when we substitute it in, is in terms of their pre-merger share and epsilon here, which is the market demand elasticity. And if we just rewrite that, for a symmetric merger, we can rewrite that in terms of the change in the Herfindahl index and the market demand elasticity. So what you see here is, the required efficiency in the Cornea model just depends on two things: pre-merger elasticity and the change in the Herfindahl index. The level of the Herfindahl index doesn't matter at all. Okay, so what I've done here is then just, so that's our point about the form. That is, in the Cornea model, once you condition on the change in the Herfindahl and the elasticity, and let's say you presume an elasticity for the typical market, there's no point in, conditioning on the level of the Herfindahl. The second point, which is about how what do these levels look like, is something that I'm showing here in the table. That is how stringent should we be in when we look at the change in the Herfindahl that might harm consumers. So that's going to depend on the elasticity and the synergy level. On the left, what I'm giving is the change in the Herfindahl index. And so what I've put in this red box is just, if you thought, I'm willing to credit the typical merger with a 3% efficiency, like if I don't know anything, I'll just, that seems to me a reasonable credit. If that's your view, and you think, typical market level elasticity might be, 1.5, then the change in the Herfindahl that you require in order to not harm consumers, that change in the Herfindahl has to be 38 or less. If the change in the Herfindahl is above 38, then consumers are going to be harmed. On the right, which I'm just giving the, what market share corresponds to that for a symmetric merger. So you see, it's 4%. Gee, that looks, and of course, that looks a lot like the 1968 guidelines. So that's what happens in the Cornea model. More general, I should say, for symmetric mergers. So more generally, we get a condition for consumer surplus neutrality in the Cornea model for mergers that are asymmetric, and it's a generalization of the previous condition that also takes account of what we call the within merger Herfindahl, which is just defined as follows: take the merging firms shares, square them, and divide by the square of the sum of the merging firms shares. So that's a number that's going to be between 0.5 and 1. And so the more asymmetric are the firms, the less efficiency gain you have to worry about. And that's kind of intuitive because, at some level, if one of the firms is a 0 share firm, then there's nothing to worry about. So anyway, okay. And, a corollary of that, and, a different way to state what I just said, which is going to turn out to be true in the other two theoretical models as well, is that the marginal cost reduction that is required to prevent consumer harm falls when you take a sum preserving spread of the merging firm shares. So that just follows from what I said a moment ago. We'll see the same point in the CES and the Logit models that I'll talk about next.
Mike, there was a question in the chat by Georg Goetz. He's asking, isn't change in HHI closely related to its level?
What we're saying, there is a relation in that there's a bound that, and we'll see this later. I'll point this out later. There's a bound in what the change can be, given the post-merger level. But what we're saying here is that once you condition on the change in the Herfindahl, there's no point. You don't want to, in the Cornea model, you don't want to be conditioning on the level. And so what that's, put in a different, stating that in a different way, it doesn't matter what the concentration is among the firms that are not merging. Okay. So, take whatever the shares are of the merging firms, that determines delta HHI. If you start changing what the shares are of the non-merging firms, that's not going to change the efficiency gain that's required to prevent consumer harm from unilateral effects in the Cornea model. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next thing we do in the theory section is we look at price competition with two models of price competition with differentiated goods, the CES and the Logit. I put CES in red and Logit in black because I'm not going to actually show you derivations at all for the Logit. And I'm going to be, admittedly, I'll be brief about the CES as well, but just to make clear what I'm going to do. Okay, so we're going to think about settings where there are products, K, a product is K out of some set of products N in a market. And the cost of producing product K, the unit cost, is CK. A firm F is there, firms in some capital set F. A specific firm is little f. And basically each firm offers some set of these products that are in the market. So we're considering multi-product firms here. So then in the CES model, the demand for firm K, for product K, I should say, depends on, turns out to depend on two things. One is PK, which is the price of product K. And the other is what I'll call A, the market aggregator, where A is defined as follows. You can think of it as basically a value from an outside good, if there is one, and the sum of actually these numerators times their price. So the sum of the revenues of the different firms, and that is your aggregator A. So prices of rival firms end up mattering only through the way they affect A. So this is a point that's been made really nicely by Volcker and in the Noki-Schutz paper, and Volcker, both of them, of course. And have to give, due to our to Nicola in our organizer as well. So in a really nice paper, in terms of pointing out that these models, like the Cornea game, are aggregative games in which demand has the structure that I just looked at, and consumer surplus, in fact, equals log of A. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the derivations. I refer you, if you don't know their paper already, you should definitely read it. But the key thing here is the firm's markup. It has an equal markup on all of its products. The market share, which in the CES model, is naturally defined in terms of revenue shares, because total revenue in the market is what's fixed, are determined as functions of the aggregator A and firm F's type, which they call TF. So TF is, this key type is equal to the sum of the contributions to the aggregator that the firm's different products make if they were priced at marginal cost. Okay. And then this condition I gave down here is the condition, you can think of it as the condition that describes in equilibrium the relationship between a firm's market share and a firm's type, as a fraction of the aggregator A. Okay. Of course, the elasticities enter as well. The elasticity parameter sigma enters as well. So if you look at this expression, this expression relates firm's type to their share. And if you use it, you then can get the following result, which is, for a merger to be CS neutral in this model, we get a condition for how the type of the merging firms has to change. And basically, what you do is you take that condition that I had before. That condition that I had before, if you added up pre-merger for the two merging firms, you're just getting an expression like this times a factor that's going to cancel out. Post-merger, what has to be true is that the sum, basically, to not have any effect on consumers, to be CS neutral, it's got to be that this condition holds given that the merging firms end up not having a change in their share. So that you stick in SM here, which is their pre-merger sum of their two shares, and you use that, and basically to say that to get a condition on what T bar M has to be. So basically, this ratio has to be the same as the ratio here from the shares. So if you do that, that's giving you a condition. You can think of this as, what's the percentage change in terms of type efficiencies? What's the synergy in terms of the type synergy that has to happen? Then what you can do is relate that to what the marginal cost synergy has to be. So now, one thing that you get here as well, I should say, is I've said this before, you get the same kind of result that spread of the merging firm shares reduces the synergy that you need to have in order to prevent consumer harm. So that follows as well from Proposition 2. But then we can go and we can look at what the levels are implied in this model by this condition. So if we do that, what I've put here is the change in the Herfindahl to not get consumer harm from a symmetric firm merger in the CES model. And this is in terms of the cost synergy, not the type synergy. So the red box here is what you get if you take the same 3% synergy we talked about before. And in this case, we take the elasticity parameter sigma, which is a product level elasticity, to be 5, which is, basically like if you look at the international trade literature, for example, they are often using numbers between 4 and 6. I should say there are some estimates. Chad Syverson with co-authors has a paper that looks at estimates CES demand functions and actually does get significantly lower sigmas than this. But if you did, you'd get, if you got lower sigmas than this, the Herfindahls that would trigger concern would be lower than what I'm showing here. So, but with using sigma equal to 5 and a 3% efficiency, what you see is, it's a significantly higher level of cost synergy, of change in the Herfindahl that triggers concern. Here it would be 242. Before, if you remember, we were at a number like 38 in the Cornea model. So it's much with this differentiated product model, it is a much higher level of delta H that triggers concern. But at the same time, it's not a particularly it's not a super high level either. It still reflects a significant fairly stringent level at which you would be concerned. Now, the other thing, of course, is, which I wrote up here, but I didn't emphasize a moment ago, is, again, once you control for sigma here, it's just the merging firm shares that matter. So it's not delta H that matters here, but it is only the merging firm shares that matter. Okay. So it's again, in terms of the form, it's again emphasizing this, coming up with this conclusion that in this model, once you control for the merging firm shares, you don't need to think about the shares of the rivals. That is, the post-merger H level of the Herfindahl shouldn't matter. Okay, so we also look at the, I should say one other thing here. These are numbers that assume no outside good. So if you had an outside good, these would be the right delta H numbers, but the market shares that you calculate that would lead to that would be the comprehensive shares, including the share of the outside good. So if you wanted to turn that into shares of the inside good, what you would do is you would divide these numbers by 1 minus the outside good share. And in the paper, we show how to relate this to, that you can relate this to the elasticity, the market level elasticity of demand. So for example, one thing we show is that if the market demand elasticity is 1.5 and sigma's 5, then, the inside shares that are the critical levels would be at most 14% higher than what I'm showing you in this table. Okay. On the right, we have just the numbers that you get from the Logit model. I should say in the Logit model, it takes a bit more assumptions to start talking about cost synergies and percentages. The Logit model naturally leads to critical synergy levels in absolute levels rather than percentages. So, we are able to do that at least in the case where the industry is fully symmetric. And here I'm giving that number for a fully symmetric industry where epsilon F is the elasticity of the firm. So of the firm level demand. Okay. All right, so that's everything I wanted to say about these three theoretical models. So the basic bottom line here is twofold. In terms of the form, these are models in which once you control, you say, or either control for or say you're willing to assume a typical level of elasticity in a market that are in markets that are being defined. It's really only the merging firm shares, and therefore perhaps delta H that you want to look at. The post-merger level really isn't relevant. And then second, we see relatively stringent levels of delta HHI that we want to be looking at. Certainly extremely stringent in the Cornea model, less so in these differentiated product models. Okay. All right, so the next part, I have about 12 minutes. So hopefully I can do this next part relatively quickly.
Well, you started 2 minutes late, so 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, thanks. I have a compromised chair here. It's going to give me more time. Okay, that's good. All right, so let me now talk about the analysis we do in brewing. So, kind of the key thing, those models led to, pretty nice results in terms of just the change in the HHI mattering and what the levels would look like for that. But those models are quite special. And, the thing we were, naturally you wonder after you look at those models was, what do we see in quote unquote actual markets? What would the same lessons come through? And in particular, a natural concern is that in markets in which product differentiation does not take the forms that we assumed in the two CES and Logent models, would we still see that just the merging firm shares seem to be what's important? So what we did is we used the Miller-Weinberg estimated model to simulate mergers. So Miller and Weinberg looked at markets, basically city level markets for beer. And there were 39 cities, and their demands, the estimated demand, their demand system included 5 different firms, different companies offering beer products. As well, they had an outside good, and the demand system was a random coefficient nested Logent model. They actually estimated 2 different versions, what they called RCNL1 and RCNL3. At least I should say 2 different versions that we'll focus on. Key difference, RCNL3, I think arguably did a better job at control, explicitly included as a characteristic whether a particular product was foreign, which I think is one of the key differentiators. So, at some level that may be a better model to look at. One that it's a little bit, when you look at the estimates, it's a little further from Logent. So I think it's perhaps the more interesting to look at. Okay, so what did we do? So in each of these 39 cities, we have 10 possible mergers between pairs of these 5 firms that were in the demand system. And so what we did is we, for various different levels of merger synergies that the merging firms could be presumed to achieve, we simulated, we did a merger simulation looking at, to compute what the resulting prices would be. And then what we did is we, basically identified what the synergy level was at which consumer surplus would be unchanged, okay? Having done that, we then looked at how that required synergy level in these 390 different mergers is related to the level of the post-merger level of the Herfindahl and the change in the Herfindahl. I should say, by the way, those of you who know the Miller-Weinberg paper, their focus, of course, was on coordinated effects. So, just to be really clear, we're using this demand system as a laboratory for looking at unilateral effects. We're not saying that this would be the actual effect of these particular beer mergers. Okay. All right. So if you do this, this is I'm showing you here a graph for the RCN-L3 demand system. We also distinguish by whether we measure shares in terms of volume or revenue. So here I'm showing you volume. The results are very, very similar, regardless of which demand system you use and whether you use volume or revenue for shares. But I'll just focus on this case today. So what I'm doing here is actually a similar picture to kind of those pictures of the merger guidelines I showed you before. This is the post-merger naive HHI change, and this, sorry, not change, level. And on the vertical axis is the change in the HHI. And what each point here is one of these 390 mergers. And the symbols or colors are basically indicating how big a synergy is required in that merger to prevent consumer harm. So green is a 0 to 5% synergy, brown is 5 to 10, blue 10 to 15, red above 15. So two things to note here. One is just a side point to the question that came up before. Yes, delta HHI is related to the post-merger level of the HHI. There's a bound, and you can see that here, that in the fact that these points, the upper bound of the change in the Herfindahl is upward sloping. But the key thing is, what we're interested in is, once you control for the HHI, does the level of the HHI matter for this required synergy? And the key thing you can kind of just eyeball here really easily is, it kind of looks like a layer cake. Like, the change here, once you control for the naive HHI, it doesn't really matter very much just visually for what color you're looking at, what the level of the HHI is. So that's kind of the key point that comes out here in terms of the form. We go somewhat further than this. So this is just a regression of the same thing. So here for RCN-L3, this is just a regression of the required synergy on the level of the HHI and its change, which we call delta. So the coefficient is the top number, standard error is second, t statistic is next. You can see the level of the HHI is insignificant. The change is extremely significant. It's also true quantitatively. The level effect is very small. The change effect is quite large. We then extend this to sort of a second order, to include second order terms, the square of HHI and delta HHI and their interaction. Those terms do matter. You can reject that they're all 0. So column 5 does that for the full sample, and column 6 does it for a subsample that is where most of the data is for, which is where the post-merger level in the Herfindahl is between 1,000 and 4,000. And so the next figure is just graphing that last, what you get out of that last regression. So for example, if you were, these are the level sets. So if you said that the efficiency gain was 3%, what does that regression tell you about the combinations of post-merger level of HHI and change in the HHI at which consumers are not harmed? And what you can see here is, yeah, it's not a totally straight line, but it is very, very flat. The effect of the level of the HHI is very small. And then in terms of the level for 3%, what you're seeing is a change in the HHI in this data that, it's somewhere between 150 and 175, roughly, at the peak. So, okay. So next thing what we do, this next figure is doing something a little different. It's looking at the welfare effects of the mergers as a function of the efficiency gain that we think the mergers would generate. And it's looking at different possible policies that could be followed and what the welfare effect would be on consumers if all of these mergers had been proposed. So I should say as a caveat, these are, when we look, we're looking here at this whole 390 different mergers. Of course, in equilibrium, it may, some of these mergers might be proposed, others not proposed. And so, that's kind of just a caveat on these numbers. It doesn't mean that you would necessarily expect this to be the population of proposed mergers. Okay, so what am I doing here? So yellow is showing you the optimum. It's showing you basically the welfare, it's measuring the welfare change. If there's, first, if there's a 1% efficiency gain in each of these mergers, then if there's 2, 3, and 5. And the way it's measuring the welfare change is as follows. It's for each, what optimum means is we're going to accept mergers that improve consumer surplus, reject mergers that harm consumers. So of course, if you do that, the merger is always going to be, the merger process is always going to be good for consumers. And the bigger the efficiency gains, the better it's going to be for consumers. And the way we're measuring these efficiency, the level of welfare effect for consumers is as follows. It's in terms of what percentage reduction in the prices of all of the firms in products in Miller Weinberg's demand system, the inside goods, would be equivalent to the consumer surplus change that occurs from the merger process. So assume there's no merger process, we're going to find that graph here, what price change is equivalent to the merger process. So what you can see here is for the optimum, it's small for 1% efficiency gains in these mergers, but it grows, it's a bigger and, a more and more negative price change, i.e. prices fall, the equivalent price change is a bigger and bigger drop in prices as the mergers get more efficient. Okay. The next line, gray, is kind of a delta HHI policy. So it's a pretty crude policy where basically we find for these 390 mergers, the critical threshold of delta HHI at which welfare is maximized, where you accept mergers that have a lower change in the Herfindahl than the critical level, and you reject them if they have a higher level. The critical thresholds we get are shown here for the different, over here for the different efficiency levels. So they range from, with 1% efficiency, it would be 37, up to 5% efficiency, where it would be 269. And the key thing that you can kind of see here is this policy, which is pretty crude, it's not using anything other than delta HHI, is pretty close to the optimum policy in terms of the welfare gain. And then the last two lines here are the effect of where we plot what the effect would be of the 2010 horizontal merger guidelines and 1982 horizontal merger guidelines. And when we do that, what we do is the following. If a merger falls into the green safe harbor area for that version of the merger guidelines, we say it's approved. If it falls into the red, we say it's rejected. And if it falls into the yellow, what we say is 75% of the time, the agencies would investigate and get it correct. So of course, depending on that percentage, it affects how good these merger guidelines are going to be for welfare. Where these things are plotted, assuming that basically 75% of the time they get it right. So the key thing to notice, two things to notice here, number one, these merger guidelines, they don't actually generate, the merger process doesn't generate a gain for consumers until merger efficiencies are at least 5%. And second, the 2010 guidelines are not as good for welfare under this analysis as the 82 guidelines. Okay, so all right. In the paper we do, and I'll just point you to the paper for this without really discussing it. We kind of break down the 2010 guidelines by, what share, in each zone, colored zone, what share of the mergers would harm consumers. And we do it for a 3% gain, where kind of a key point here is that many of the mergers that fall into the safe harbor at low concentration levels actually would harm consumers in these 390 mergers. For 5%, that number does drop significantly, although it's still over 25%. Okay, so in my last, I probably have 1 minute, so let me just say, there's the next and last substantive section of the paper is a discussion section, and asks 2 questions. One, in terms of the form of these concentration thresholds, are there things that we're have left out of our analysis that perhaps could make the level of the Herfindahl index matter? That is, that you might want to look at the Herfindahl index level, not just its change. So here I'm just listing 5 things that we talk about. Obviously, one of them is coordinated effects, which we're explicitly not considering. A second is that rivals might have responses that are not price responses. A third thing that I think is, something to think about in a serious way is, it could be that efficiency gains are related to the level of, in a typical merger that's proposed might be related to the level of concentration in the market, the level of competition. So I think that is potentially an avenue that one might explore. And then, another thing is that maybe the antitrust agency is not, might not be in a position to prevent consumer harm entirely, either because the legal standard is different. Like maybe you have to harm consumers in a significant way in order to have your merger be blocked, or maybe the antitrust agencies have enforcement budget constraints that limit what the mergers they could look at. So we discuss that in this section, and I think the key thing is, overall, I think all of these things could make sense. I think our view is at some level, what our analysis does is at some level, I think it kind of raises the bar for what you'd want to see as a justification for these, for using the Herfindahl. Okay. And then finally, there's a discussion of, these results that I just showed you, should we take from that current merger screening thresholds, at least in the US, are too lax? And the main points here, is it depends a lot on what you think, typical synergies are. And, casual observation, experience with mergers, agency skepticism towards merger efficiencies, to us, suggests that 5% is rather optimistic for the typical merger. But at the same time, it is really striking that the literature is very limited. The evidence in the literature is really extremely limited relative to what we need it to be about what these efficiencies are typically. In the end, our sense from all of this is that we do think these thresholds are most likely too lax, but I think more work is really needed on that too. So I have a conclusion slide, but I think hopefully it's all been clear, and I want to leave time for questions, so I'll just stop.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. Well, let's clap maybe and thank Mike. Although of course, it's a little bit sort of somewhat biased here. Anyway, so maybe we have time, at least 10 minutes or so, for questions and answers. And however, I should remind, Martin told me I should remind everyone that this is going to be recorded. But please, that shouldn't make you shy. So please do ask questions. And my expectation is actually that people tend to be too shy. So just shout. You don't need to wait just ask. But if you're shy and don't want to ask because it's recorded, you can also send a question through the chat, in which case I'm going to ask that question.
Maybe you can answer it too.
Well, we'll see. No. Okay, so very good. So I have some, does anyone want to, first, let's come to people who really want to, say something in person. Otherwise, I'm going to just read some questions. So there was one by Dan Savell, who's asking, should we be concerned that the theory models presented are aggregative games with constant unit costs? One empirical example that relaxes the aggregate game requirement. My intuition is that this may be the most ideal set of assumptions to validate HHI thresholds rather than invalidate them. Pushing on costs, have you considered different cost functions? Pushing on demands, have you tried simulating or solving for worst case scenarios using a random coefficients or something similar? In summary, are there worst case scenario models for these merger thresholds?
Okay. Short answer, completely agree. Actually, that was exactly the motivation behind looking at the beer, beer data, is that, yes, I mean, we picked those theory models precisely because, I mean, I think, we literally say this in the paper, they were the ones most likely to generate, to be settings where, shares and concentration measures would, potentially do a good job. And that's why we, didn't want to stop there. We felt that we wanted to look at kind of more realistic settings and, somewhat unfortunately, the settings that you can, one thing you can do is just start simulating other, other structures, but we didn't want to just do that in the sense that, like, where would we get the parameters? We wanted kind of at least the parameters to be realistic. So that's why we kind of, we're looking around for, any setting where we could do this, do this kind of exercise, like in, what turned out to be the beer case, where, what were we looking for is settings where, we had, a lot of potential mergers that we could look at. And those mergers, when I say potential mergers, they were mergers between real firms. So that, like, you could do, serial, but in serial, the problem would be there aren't that many firms. So you could start doing mergers, of shifting products around, but those are not, mergers of actual firms. And so what was nice here is we had all these local markets with firms operating, and they had very different shares in the different markets. So we had a lot of variation in shares in these potential markets. And of course, we needed some place where someone had actually estimated demand and costs, and where the demand they estimated wasn't a straight logit. So there weren't, basically beer was it. At least that's what we thought, that's how it came to us. I think possible that someone could do something like this in airlines. That's another possibility. But, it'd be great to do more of it. And in terms of your question about worst case scenarios, yeah, I mean, it is possible to have, it's not hard to think of settings where, concentration measures do really badly because you have two firms that, in your supposed market are, have significant shares, but they actually have very little diversion between them. So, I think, one issue for the beer is that, even in RCNL3, maybe it's not that far from logit when you look at the estimates. It's further than the RCNL1. But, I think seeing whether, how much of a difference it makes, if we had other examples that were, more examples of markets we could do this in, to see how often it does badly. I think would be interesting to see. I should say, I didn't point this out, in the beer industry, I didn't point out the R squared, but the R squared on those regressions is absurdly high. So, I'm sure there'd be other cases where it wasn't as good.
Okay, thank you. So there is another question, but maybe by Filippo Lancieri. So I'm just going to read. You wanted to know, related to your last remarks, I guess it's probably going to relate to, I guess, not the conclusion slide, but the ones before, I guess. How do you square them with Professor Quoker's review of merger analysis in the US? I'm not quite sure what he's referring to.
I think it's very consistent in the sense, I think you're referring to his book looking at merger retrospectives, and that the lesson there seems to be that mergers are often leading to price increases, so allowed mergers. And so, this is coming at it from a different angle in terms of the discussion about whether thresholds are too lax, but kind of coming up with from that different angle, a somewhat parallel lesson.
Okay, Georg Götz is raising his hand. He would like to ask a question. So Georg, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you for this very nice talk. And it's very interesting to see how these efficiencies interact with market power in a sense, and what you should have as a screen. The first question is, you already mentioned that how important market definition is. So I just wonder what Louis Kapler would say to that, as he says, we don't need to define markets. The more important question from my point of view is, as you also stressed, the competition policy conclusions, or that you have some policy conclusions, is if we look into the most disputed European mergers, which were typically 4 to 3 mergers in the telecom sector, where it's clear from the very beginning that if I apply any screen, it's clear that this is a problematic merger. And of course, efficiency must be very important, or whatever it is, or actually it was remedies which the Commission turned to in a sense. But here you have typically marginal cost of 0, so you cannot have any efficiencies in terms of marginal cost. So it must be some, I think there is this other point in this dynamic, in this chat with the dynamic efficiency. So my question is actually, hopefully you get this, what it really helps us or antitrust authorities to have this kind of screens for actual antitrust analysis, because the point is the most important mergers or the most disputed ones are those typically and those who go to phase 2, or those where it's clear from anyway where you look at HHI or whatever you do.
Okay, so I think there were kind of 2 questions in there. I think the first one was about Louis Kapler's point, like the argument that, well, we shouldn't be defining markets at all. So, I guess I'd say 2 things about that. One, at some level, I'm kind of, in the ideal world, I'm kind of sympathetic to that. Like, if we have, we know, like, if we can, estimate the whole structure of a market and, look, have measures of different, how diversion and differentiation, we can simulate the effects of mergers ideally, and without ever defining a market. And, like my old handbook chapter, I think had a whole section, called, breaking the market definition mold, which was, really kind of making the similar kind of argument. I think there's kind of 2 things, though. One is a practical point, which is just, at least, in the U.S., and I think, maybe it's a little different. The flexibility is a little different in Europe, perhaps. But there's case law, and the courts are using market definition and concentration levels, and they're looking to the agencies for what those concentration levels should be. And so, if the agencies are coming into court with these with these kind of natural market definitions like beer, you need your thresholds to be tailored to that, and so at some level I kind of view this, the exercise here is saying, okay, if we're doing these concentration measures, what should they best look like in terms of form and level? Now, a separate question is, should we be doing it at all? And I think, of course, in the ideal world, we wouldn't need to define markets. We would just estimate everything. But I think there's some argument for, I don't, we aren't, our paper is not doing this. Someday, I think there'll be a paper that successfully does this, of talking about how to think about the different pieces of evidence that a court should look at when there's uncertainty about, estimates, and, why you might want to have concentration measures, these kind of presumptions in the law based on simple things like concentration measures. I don't think we're there, actually. So I kind of view this paper as conditional on doing this. How should we do it? But I think there's a significant difficult issue about exactly what pieces of evidence should be weighed and how should they be weighed. Okay, the second question was about actual mergers in telecom. I was a little less clear on what the question is, but I would say, these kinds of mergers where these kind of considerations come up are, really, I think happen all the time. So, a few years ago, I testified in a merger of Electrolux and GE appliances where, they had proposed, actually the merging parties' proposal for efficiencies was 3%. And, and there were very high levels of concentration. There was very high level, UPP, if you calculated that, was super high. So, I think these comparisons and, comparisons to potential efficiencies, are important in a lot of mergers. Now, sometimes it's not about the efficiencies we were talking about here. In some mergers, it might be about investments, as you were saying, dynamic efficiencies. But ultimately, efficiencies are the reason why we want to have mergers happen. So, when we think they're present, sufficiently present.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions? I don't see any. So then let's thank again Mike.
Okay. Anyway.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks. It would be nice to be there talking to you, but anyway.
Indeed.
So we'll have coffee another time, I guess.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.